involved with the building of it and the motivation behind it and with the architects to where he really pushed to have this thing done, within his lifetime. And what's really, to me, really amazing about what they did was they were able to do all that architecture and all that building within a relatively short amount of time. So within 15 years, you had this amazing, architectural masterpiece.
There was an earlier temple to Athena there that was destroyed by the Persians in 480 BC. The pre-Parthenon, if you're speaking of the earlier temple, was a temple on the Acropolis.
The pre-Parthenon was very similar to the one we know today. It was at the same place. It has a little bit different dimensions, and it was an older type, let's say, of this classical type of Doric temple. But the purpose was the same, and the idea was the same.
The reasons why the Parthenon was built are actually several. I suppose most importantly, the Parthenon was constructed to be a thank offering to the goddess Athena. The Greeks in general, and the Athenians in particular, wanted to honor Athena and all of their gods with great buildings, with impressive sculpture, and the latter, in fact, of which there's a great deal of sculpture on the Parthenon, has been called by Brunilda Ridgway prayers in stone.
And so if the question relates to this particular piece of architecture, this particular Parthenon, I would say that it's not only built to honor the goddess Athena, but it was built to represent all that Athens was.
Parthenon is paradoxically both a typical Greek temple and a very unusual one.
Many of the temples that were built in ancient Greece were just built in wood. The building of the Parthenon in marble was a project of Pericles and of Periclean Athens. Athens had become flush with money.
Yeah, the Parthenon is a very unique building because, first of all, it was constructed by this unique material, the Centennial marble, but also it had peculiarities, let's say. It combined the Doric with the Ionic style.
It's an intriguing combination of the two architectural orders, though I should say it's not the first Greek temple that was constructed in this, shall we call it, hybrid order with the Doric and the Ionic.
The balance of Athens is conveyed by the use, I think, of both forms of columns. Pericles emphasized that we are great poets, we are great thinkers, great philosophers, great writers. We know beauty. Unlike Sparta, which is so militaristic, we are able to appreciate the finer things in life. We are good family people, we are businessmen, we're musicians, we're athletes, and all of that, yet we can fight as well.
And they used some similar architectural techniques that they had in the past, even with things that I think they'd previously done on the Acropolis prior. But they made the lines closer. Normally the spacing was different, but they used shorter spacing between the pillars, which I think helped add to that image that people see and that people have mimicked throughout history.
The temple of Athena on Aegina, which is also associated with the goddess Athena. And there the temple is rather well preserved. It's an archaic temple. And that gives you a good sense of what a late archaic temple looked like before the Parthenon. And the Parthenon was kind of, what was really new about it was that it was a true monument. It was massive in structure, but it didn't look weighty as the archaic temples had.
But the pillars themselves, what I really liked was the way that they constructed them. They made those pieces in segments, and they would do a segment at a time. And as they created a segment of the pillar, they would create a rectangular hole in the middle, and they would take these wooden dowels and they'd place them in the middle of that, so that way when they made the next piece, it would fit on there and they would be able to line it up. And to me, that's pretty remarkable. And when we think about, other structures, we think about, famous places in multiple countries and capitals and buildings that were created that use those similar column features that the ancient Greeks used. I mean, it's just remarkable that they saw this big symbol of what made the Greeks special with their architecture are the similar things that they would then pull in later on throughout many different centuries to create that similar effect in multiple countries around the world.
The Parthenon includes a number of features that are sometimes referred to as optical refinements. Curvature of all of the horizontal elements, tipping in of the vertical elements, thickening of the corner columns. These are not unique to the Parthenon, and in fact some of these features begin as much as a century before the Parthenon. But the fact that the Parthenon combines all of these features and does so in a very refined fashion is also somewhat unusual. Also typical of Greek temples, the Parthenon has a front porch and a back porch, a pronaos and an opisthotomus. It has a central cella, a central naos, a place where the cult image would stand. This is fundamental to any Greek temple. As is very common in Greek temples, it also has a ring of columns around it, a colonnade, making it, as we call it, a peripteral temple. It stands on 3 steps, which is also quite usual for Greek temples of its period. Unusually, the Parthenon has a back treasury room between the naos and the back porch. Parthenon is covered with sculpture. The fact that the Parthenon combines all of that sculpture and has a massive program of sculpture is really quite unusual.
The temple served as a temple to Athena for several hundred years. She did not last that long. At some point, she was dismantled. She was made of wood overlaid with ivory and gold that were on in plates that could be jerked off.
In one point, we don't know exactly when, we have some ideas that the building was transformed to a Christian church. Probably it was in the late 6th century AD. So that means that it served as a Athena temple for 1,200 years almost.
The Romans were absolutely in love with Athens. And this is particularly true of emperors like Hadrian in the great time of the Roman Empire, which is the 2nd century AD. The emperors were fascinated with Athens, and Hadrian built it up. So much money was spent in building theaters, such as the Odeon of Herod and the Temple of the Olympian Zeus. All of these, and a library. Hadrian built a great library. He built a Roman Forum. He built the Tower of the Winds there. So Athens was beautified under the Romans. So Athens then becomes the epitome to the Romans of all the Greek culture is. They're very proud of it. They took care of it.
The Temple of Athena lasted for so long because the Christians took over the Roman Empire very early, after the 3rd or the 4th century AD. But in Athens, because of the philosophical schools and because of the fame of the city, and because it was at the edge of the Roman Empire, the ancient religion was very strong and vivid, and the Christians were a minority for many centuries until the Justinian. After the Justinian, the situation changed. He closed the philosophical schools in 522, and after that, we have a decline of the city, and the Christians took over, and slowly, the character of the city changed, and the ancient religion just started to, be suppressed and disappeared at the end. From the moment that the statue disappeared, which must have happened middle to end of the 5th century, until the building was transformed to a Christian church, maybe it was a gap of 1 century or 1.5 century, and the building must have been empty or closed or used, I don't know for what. We don't know for what.
The Byzantines are really a continuation of the Romans. I mean, the Byzantines saw themselves in the lineage of the Romans, and so they were a Christian empire, and that sort of continuity of the Parthenon as a church was maintained.
And so in the 6th century, we have evidence of the inhabitants of Athens and much of Greece finally embracing Christianity.
They didn't destroy the building though. I mean, that shows that the transition between the ancient religion to the Christian religion was a peaceful one in Athens.
The Christians and pagans seem to have existed rather peacefully, side by side, for a number of years. However, once we get past 381, when paganism becomes illegal and Christianity is the only religion of the empire, then tension does rise. But of course, at this point, paganism has no strength left to it and no ability to resist the Christian development.
The taking over of the Parthenon was a symbolic gesture on the part of the Christians to show or to express the victory of Christ over polytheistic religion.
So first of all, the changes were minimal, in the sense that you would not have been in any doubt about what you were looking at after the changes.
The Parthenon is sort of symbolic of architectural perfection in the fact that it had many refinements. It embodied what came to be the classical proportions of the prototypical Greek temple. In the Christian period, they didn't care about that factor. They just needed a space for the congregation, and that would be only in larger temples like the Parthenon.
You have those early Christians that start coming about as you get into the 5th century. And all of a sudden they see this pagan temple and they're like, well, here we are now, we're Christians, so we're going to have to make some changes to this.
When the newly Christianized Greeks decided to convert the temple of Athena Parthenos into a Christian church, they were faced with a fundamental problem. And that fundamental problem is that most Greek temples have their fronts, their facades, on the eastern side. And so the doors, when they were opened during the course of pagan worship, would allow the sun, especially in the morning, to stream into the building and to illuminate the cult image of the deity. But for Christians, the usual orientation of a building was to have the apse, the innermost end of the building, to the east. Consequently, the newly Christianized Greeks had to essentially turn the building around 180 degrees. Now, obviously, they couldn't pick up the building and physically turn it around, so they had to turn it around in terms of changing some of the interior arrangements. What had once been the back of the Parthenon, the western side, became the front. And that treasury room, which had once held the valuables of the goddess Athena and the valuables of the city of Athens, became the entrance to the church. At least one doorway, and probably ultimately 3, were cut between that treasury room and the main naos, or cella.
they put in a apse on the east side, closing off the front entrance of the church. They made the apse because an apse was the normal ground plan for churches at that time.
While they also did that, I should mention too, they removed parts of those friezes that had gone around as well. You know, it's a kind of tragic to me to think about, you know, all the beauty that really got lost.
The only attempt to make a radical change to the sculptures would have been on the part of Christians who resented the idea of representing human figures or worshiping people and gods, and therefore they decapitated many of them and sometimes destroyed them. Now, that, having said that, is also true. The Muslims do not tolerate any form of graven image, any form of representation, and so they would also do that. I think the Christians did it for them, so they didn't have to do much defacing, but they would have if there was anything left.
But the Christians really targeted images. That's what they were trying to destroy, idolatry and this kind of stuff. So it was a different sort of destruction.
In that 1,000-year period of time, all awareness of its past, and this is just bizarre, was lost. One reason for that is the medieval period is a period without a sense of time perspective. You have to think about the medieval mindset. It follows a pattern of believing the way things are today is the way they always have been. So to be able to, for these people to imagine that there were non-Christian, pagan priests performing rituals there, burning incense to a gigantic statue of a pagan goddess, was completely incomprehensible to these people. From their standpoint, this was always a church. And so people came, it is said, from all over the Christian world to see the Christian relics, to see the beauty of a Christian cathedral with absolutely no consciousness of the past. And that is just the way medieval man thought. And that's the strange thing about that 1,000 years. So no, we don't have anyone writing a history of it, because as far as they're concerned, this is just the church. The cathedral in Athens is here, and it's always been here.
And there's this mythology about how if it weren't for the Christians, all these things, would have been destroyed. Well, if there were no Christianity, when economic times got better, the polytheistic peoples would have rebuilt the temple in its ancient form. We know that Augustus Caesar restored something like 82 temples in Rome alone. And this was typical through all of antiquity. So this idea that if it weren't for the Christians, we wouldn't have all these buildings. Well, and if it weren't for Christianity, they wouldn't have destroyed a great deal, which is enormous how much they destroyed and mutilated. But see, that hasn't really been studied that well. So most scholars don't know about the enormous destruction of the Christians. I mean, again, what ISIL's doing, or what is done today with a lot of these monuments, that's what the Christians were doing in their period, because they believed that they had the truth, the true religion, and were trying to destroy or negate. So they approach it from adaptation and, giving new life and all this sort of stuff, not in terms of destruction and desecration.
The Ottomans, they just took over everywhere.
So basically, the Ottomans are taking over the Byzantine Empire, which now included Greece again. They were expanding in that area after they defeated the Byzantines in Constantinople.
But they respected the Parthenon because they admired it very much. We have written sources from that period.
As new civilizations come in, it's almost like they bring in their, religious interior designers. All right, let's tear out all this Christian stuff. Now let's make it a Muslim worshiping place.
One advantage they had in taking over the Christian Parthenon and converting into a mosque is that a lot of work had been done during the Christian period.
And The conversion to a mosque was probably not a difficult thing for them to do, and the transition was a relatively simple one.
The significant structural change that the Ottoman Turks brought to the Parthenon was to convert the bell tower that had been constructed in the second Christian phase of the Parthenon. The Ottoman Turks converted that bell tower into a minaret, which of course is a fundamental feature to a mosque. It was from the minaret that the call for prayer would go out to the Muslims in the city of Athens from that time. Now, the foundations, the base of that minaret were already in place because they were the foundations and base of the bell tower.
They just lime washed the interiors to make it white, and they covered the paintings of the Christians, but they left the mosaic.
Using the building not only as a mosque but also as an armament store. And at that time they were in conflict with the Venetians, who came to the city of Athens, set up their cannons on the nearby Philippopolis Hill, and started shooting at the Parthenon.
And that was a terrible thing, really. It was something that everybody regretted once it happened.
The devastation was pretty enormous. I mean, most of the statues had received at least partial damage to them. A lot of the pieces of the statues that were less durable for sure got destroyed when the bomb hit. Heads, arms.
The Venetians captured Athens, and they just left after 3 months because they didn't want it at the end. So it was really ironic that they came, they destroyed the Parthenon, and they just left after that. And it was a small square building with no minaret. They didn't have a minaret, so they used, the fragments of the Parthenon and stayed there until the middle of 19th century.
But the damage didn't just end with the Venetians, doing that. As more people came in, over the years, looting occurs. More damage as people are trying to get into the building, more destruction. They had to worry almost less about invading armies, but more about just people visiting the place, because there wasn't really a whole lot of security in the place. So we'd have foreign visitors that would come in and be like, oh great, I'm going to Athens, I want to go see the Parthenon. They go in the Parthenon and they're like, nobody's really caring, and people were just looting. Visitors would come in and they'd be like, oh, I can take that. And they would just take pieces with no accountability, no regard.
Later on, after the Greek War of Independence, they took out the mosque. They removed it, as they did it didn't fit the new national, concept of classical Greece, so they removed it. And I remember in one case too, I think it was down by the Roman Agora, there was one of those madrasas where they, during the Ottoman period, and they converted that school into a latrine because they so detested the Ottoman Turks. So it was a way to, add insult by turning it into a latrine. So, that was part of their policy to get rid of the non-classical Greek stuff.
Today, we have considerable evidence for most of the Parthenon. A lot of that is standing, but not all of it is. Certainly the foundations of the building are there, as well as the 3 steps on which the main part of the building rests. The colonnade around the Parthenon is largely standing today. After the explosion of 1687, most of the columns on the 2 long sides, the north and south of the building, had been blown out, especially at the center. Those columns have been re-erected since the beginning of the 19th century, when Greece won its independence from the Ottoman Turks. Most of the material that was used in the earlier restoration projects came from the original Parthenon, and these pieces were scattered around the Athenian Acropolis.
Of course, we put back some of the members that we find scattered around the building. We try to put back on the building some of these fragments, as much as possible.
And some of the other buildings have been restored up there on the Acropolis.
Yes, Propylaea, they have been restored. Erechtheion, Propylaea, the Temple of Athena Nike, yes, all of the buildings. As much as, when we have material to restore, to put back on the buildings, we do it. And we stop when we don't have any more of the material. And in the case of the Parthenon, we don't have we have nothing almost from the roof, we have nothing from the interior colonnade. We have questions even how was the colonnade of the west compartment. We have nothing from that, the interior of that compartment. So there are many questions still about the original structure of the building, so we cannot reconstruct it.
In 1896, Tennessee celebrated their centennial of statehood, and they decided to have a big fair on these grounds. The city of Nashville decided to build a replica of the Parthenon because their nickname, the city's nickname, was the Athens of the South because of all the schools and universities. So it always had this distinction as a center for learning. And so in order to celebrate that nickname, they decided very ambitiously to build a replica of the Parthenon.
In fact, earlier than being called the Athens of the South, Nashville was called the Athens of the West. But as the United States expanded over the course of the 19th century, Nashville was no longer in the western part of the country, but it was in the southern part. And so the nickname was changed slightly.
And like all such events, the buildings are made to last 6 months for the event. They cannot afford permanent buildings. It would make the cost astronomical. So everything's meant to go, including the Parthenon.
Nashville's original Parthenon is not the building that we see today, but was rather meant to be a temporary building made out of stucco and wood to stand only the 6 months of the centennial celebration in 1897.
But also, for each of these fairs, they usually leave some distinctive building or structure behind. And in our case, it was the Parthenon. So they left it there until the 1920s, and by that time, it was like one of those buildings on the world after people. It had ivy growing up the columns. It was a mess.
So they create this Parthenon. If I remember correctly, the Parthenon was originally not designed to be a permanent structure. It was designed to be a temporary structure. In the 1920s, they decided that they needed to really put some money into it and, make sure that that permanent structure would be something that would last.
So they didn't tear it down, but they went back in, reinforced it, and made it a permanent building of concrete, which reopened in 1931.
And I think that, I'm glad that we still have that symbol because, now in 2016, we've become known as the It City, which when we think back historically, that's what Athens was. Athens was the it city at its time. They were the it city of the Greek civilization. So I think it's very appropriate that we have our own Parthenon here, and that we're now the it city, of our country.